July 13, 2023. Midtown Manhattan. Rex Heuermann, a towering 6 feet 4 inches architect, walks confidently down Fifth Avenue after a routine business meeting. He has no idea that FBI agents have been tracking his every move for months, collecting his discarded pizza crusts and water bottles from garbage cans across the city. He has no idea that cutting-edge DNA technology has finally connected him to hair strands found on 7 murdered women, hair that had been sitting in evidence lockers for over a decade, waiting for science to catch up with justice. He has no idea that in less than an hour his carefully constructed double life will collapse in handcuffs and headlines, revealing him as one of America's most prolific serial killers. For 13 years, the Gilgo Beach murders had remained one of Long Island's most haunting mysteries. 10 bodies discovered along Ocean Parkway. Young women who had simply vanished from the earth, their remains wrapped in burlap like discarded refuse, scattered across a desolate stretch of beach where the Atlantic Ocean keeps its darkest secrets. But DNA doesn't lie. And after more than a decade of silence, the microscopic evidence left by a methodical killer was finally ready to speak. This is the story of how revolutionary DNA technology brought down the Gilgo Beach serial killer, how a monster hid in plain sight for decades while building a respectable life as a family man and successful architect, and how the evolution of forensic science finally delivered justice to 7 women who deserved so much more than unmarked graves along a lonely highway. To understand how Rex Heuermann evaded justice for so long, we must first understand the perfect storm of circumstances that allowed him to kill with impunity while hiding behind a facade of suburban normalcy. Long Island's Ocean Parkway stretches for miles along the South Shore, a desolate ribbon of asphalt bordered by scrub brush, marshland, and the endless Atlantic. It's a place where few people venture after dark, where the sound of waves masks other sounds, and where someone could dispose of bodies with little fear of immediate discovery. Between 2007 and 2010, this lonely stretch of highway became a dumping ground for human remains, but the world wouldn't know it until December 11, 2010, when police were searching for missing 23-year-old Shannon Gilbert. Instead of finding Shannon, they found something far more horrifying. The first discovery was the body of Melissa Barthelemy, a 24-year-old from the Bronx who had been reported missing in July 2009. Her remains were found wrapped in burlap, bound with tape, and hidden in the scrub brush just feet from the parkway. But Melissa was not alone. Within days, investigators discovered 3 more bodies, all young women, all wrapped in burlap, all discarded like garbage along the same stretch of beach. Megan Waterman, 22, from Maine. Amber Lynn Costello, 27, from West Babylon. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25, from Connecticut. For women, for lives, for families destroyed by someone who viewed human beings as disposable objects. The similarities were chilling and unmistakable. All 4 victims were sex workers who had advertised services on Craigslist. All had disappeared between 2007 and 2010. All were petite women, between 4 feet 6 inches and 5 feet 2 inches. All were found within a quarter-mile stretch of Ocean Parkway, wrapped in the same type of burlap and bound with similar materials. This wasn't random violence. This was the work of a serial killer with a specific type, a preferred method, and the organizational skills to avoid detection for years. As the investigation expanded, more bodies were discovered. In total, 10 sets of human remains would be found along Gilgo Beach and the surrounding areas, victims spanning decades, some dating back to the 1990s. The killer hadn't just been active recently, he had been hunting for 20 years or more. But despite the obvious connections between the crimes, despite the clear signature of a serial predator, the investigation stalled. The victims were marginalized women whose disappearances hadn't triggered massive search efforts. The crime scenes were contaminated by time and weather. Most critically, the forensic technology of 2010 couldn't extract useful DNA from the degraded hair samples found on the victims. The killer had chosen his victims and his methods with the calculated precision of someone who understood exactly how to avoid detection. Sex workers were less likely to be quickly reported missing. Ocean Parkway was isolated enough for disposal but accessible enough for regular dumping. Burlap and tape left minimal forensic evidence using 2010 technology. Someone was very smart. Someone was very careful. Someone was getting away with murder. And that someone was living a double life that would have been impossible to believe if DNA evidence hadn't eventually proved it beyond any doubt. For 13 years, The Gilgo Beach murders remained one of the most frustrating unsolved cases in New York history. Investigators had a clear signature, obvious connections between victims, and compelling evidence of a serial killer, but no viable suspects and no forensic breakthroughs that could point them toward an arrest. Then, in January 2022, everything changed. Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney convened a new Gilgo Beach task force, bringing together federal agents, state police, and local investigators with one mission: to use every available resource and emerging technology to finally identify the killer who had evaded justice for over a decade. The task force represented a new approach to the case. Instead of treating each victim as an isolated incident, they would use advanced data analysis, behavioral profiling, and cutting-edge forensic science to build a comprehensive picture of the killer and his methods. Most importantly, they would re-examine physical evidence using DNA technology that hadn't existed when the bodies were first discovered. Hair samples that had been useless in 2010 could now potentially yield nuclear DNA profiles using whole genome sequencing, a revolutionary technique that could extract genetic information from even severely degraded biological material. The breakthrough came when investigators decided to focus on the cell phone evidence that had been largely overlooked in earlier investigations. The killer had used burner phones to contact victims, but cell tower data from those communications could still be analyzed to establish location patterns and behavioral signatures. Rex Heuermann's name first appeared as a potential person of interest not because of DNA, but because of his cell phone data and online activity. Investigators discovered that someone matching his profile had been in contact with multiple victims through Craigslist advertisements, using burner phones that consistently connected to cell towers near his home and workplace. But cell phone data and online activity, while suspicious, weren't enough for an arrest. Prosecutors needed physical evidence that could definitively link Rex Heuermann to the crime scenes and victims. That's when the task force decided to attempt something that had never been successfully done in a New York criminal case: use whole genome sequencing to extract nuclear DNA from hair samples that were over a decade old. The hair evidence was crucial because it was the only physical connection between the killer and his victims that had survived the outdoor crime scenes. Burlap, tape, and binding materials had degraded or been contaminated. But individual hair strands, if they contained root material, could potentially yield enough genetic information to identify their source. The process was painstaking and expensive. Each hair sample had to be carefully prepared and analyzed using equipment that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The testing could take weeks or months for each sample. There were no guarantees that the degraded material would yield usable results. But investigators were committed to using every available tool to finally bring justice to the Gilgo Beach victims. While the DNA testing proceeded, the task force continued building a circumstantial case against Rex Heuermann. They documented his movements on the dates when victims disappeared. They analyzed his online activity and communications. They established that he had the means, opportunity, and behavioral patterns consistent with the serial killer profile. But they also began the delicate process of collecting comparative DNA samples from Rex himself, without alerting him to the investigation. This is where the pizza crusts and water bottles came in. Federal agents began conducting surveillance of Rex Heuermann's daily routine, following him to business meetings and restaurants where he might discard items that contained his saliva or other biological material. The surveillance operation was extensive and required careful coordination. Agents had to collect discarded items without contaminating them or alerting Rex to their activities. They had to maintain chain of custody for potential evidence while conducting what amounted to a secret investigation of a man who hadn't yet been charged with any crime. In January 2023, investigators got their break. Rex Heuermann discarded pizza crusts in a Manhattan garbage can after a business lunch. Federal agents retrieved the crusts, which were immediately sent for DNA analysis. The results were unambiguous. Rex Heuermann's DNA matched genetic material found on multiple Gilgo Beach victims. But even with this crucial evidence, investigators continued building their case for months, ensuring that they had overwhelming proof before making an arrest. They knew they would have only one chance to prosecute Rex Heuermann, and they were determined to make it count. The final pieces of the puzzle came together in the summer of 2023. DNA evidence had definitively linked Rex to the victims. Cell phone data had placed him at relevant locations during the time frame of the murders. Behavioral analysis had confirmed that he fit the psychological profile of the killer. On July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested in Midtown Manhattan and charged with murder in the deaths of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. The Gilgo Beach serial killer had finally been caught, But his arrest was just the beginning of a legal and scientific revelation that would change how DNA evidence is used in criminal cases. The arrest of Rex Heuermann marked not just the end of a 13-year manhunt, but the beginning of a legal battle that would determine whether revolutionary DNA technology could be used to prosecute one of America's most prolific serial killers. The evidence against Rex was built primarily on a forensic technique called whole genome sequencing, which had never been used in a New York criminal trial. Prosecutors alleged that this cutting-edge technology had definitively linked hair from 6 of the 7 Gilgo Beach victims to Rex Heuermann, his wife, and his daughter. But Rex's defense team immediately challenged the admissibility of this evidence, arguing that the technology was largely unproven and unreliable for criminal prosecution. They claimed that whole genome sequencing was experimental science being used to railroad an innocent man. The legal battle over DNA evidence would become as complex and fascinating as the original murders themselves. Traditional DNA analysis requires relatively fresh biological material with intact cellular structure. Hair samples from crime scenes rarely yield usable results unless they contain root material with sufficient genetic information for standard testing methods. But whole genome sequencing works differently. It can extract genetic information from severely degraded biological material by analyzing the entire genome rather than just specific genetic markers. This technique can potentially identify individuals from hair samples that would be useless for traditional DNA testing. The implications were staggering. If whole genome sequencing was accepted by the courts, it could revolutionize cold case investigations by making previously useless evidence suddenly viable for forensic analysis. Investigators had used this technology to determine that hairs found on several Gilgo Beach victims belonged to Rex Heuermann or members of his immediate family. The evidence was particularly damning because it suggested that Rex's family members had been unknowingly contaminated with evidence from his crimes, probably through his clothing, vehicle, or other personal items. This family contamination evidence was crucial because it demonstrated that Rex hadn't just come into casual contact with the victims. The hair evidence suggested prolonged, intimate contact consistent with the theory that he had transported and disposed of their bodies. But the defense argued that whole genome sequencing was too new and unreliable for such high-stakes prosecution. They pointed out that the technology hadn't been extensively peer-reviewed or validated through other criminal cases. They claimed that using experimental science to prosecute murder cases violated fundamental principles of due process and scientific accuracy. The prosecution countered that whole genome sequencing had been extensively validated in medical and research settings, and that the technique was simply an advanced version of established DNA analysis methods. They argued that excluding this evidence would allow a serial killer to escape justice simply because science had evolved beyond the techniques available when the crimes were committed. The legal debate extended for months, with expert witnesses on both sides testifying about the reliability, accuracy, and appropriate use of whole genome sequencing in criminal prosecutions. Judge Timothy Matzi ultimately had to make a decision that would affect not just Rex Heuermann's case, but the future of DNA evidence in criminal justice. His ruling would establish precedent for how revolutionary forensic technology could be used in future prosecutions. In September 2024, Judge Matzi ruled that the DNA evidence would be admissible at trial, determining that whole genome sequencing was sufficiently reliable and validated for use in criminal prosecutions. Obviously, this is another tool in our toolbox, District Attorney Ray Tierney said after the ruling. Obviously, that's a key factor in this case. The ruling was historic, the first time that whole genome sequencing evidence had been approved for use in a New York criminal trial. It opened the door for prosecutors to use the most advanced DNA technology available to seek justice for the Gilgo Beach victims. But the legal implications extended far beyond Rex Heuermann's case. The ruling established that evolving forensic science could be used to solve cold cases that had previously been considered unsolvable. Hair samples, tissue fragments, and other biological evidence that had been sitting in evidence lockers for decades could now potentially yield DNA profiles that could identify killers, exonerate the innocent, and bring closure to families who had waited years for answers. The DNA evidence against Rex Heuermann was overwhelming. Prosecutors alleged that genetic material from 6 different victims had been linked to Rex or his family members through whole genome sequencing. The probability that this evidence had occurred through innocent contact was essentially zero. But even with this revolutionary DNA evidence, prosecutors continued building additional charges against Rex as more victims were identified and linked to him through forensic analysis. The case had evolved from a cold case investigation into a showcase for how advancing technology could finally deliver justice to victims who had been waiting over a decade for their killer to be held accountable. As DNA evidence continued to link Rex Heuermann to additional victims, the scope of his alleged crimes expanded beyond even the worst-case scenarios that investigators had originally considered. Rex Heuermann was initially arrested in July 2023 and charged with murder in the killings of 3 women, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. But as forensic analysis continued, more victims were connected to the same genetic evidence. In January 2024, prosecutors added murder charges related to Maureen Brainerd Barnes, whose body had been discovered along with the original 3 victims in 2010. DNA evidence had linked hair found on the belt that secured Maureen's body to Rex Heuermann's wife, suggesting that Rex had used family belongings to bind and dispose of his victims. But the case took an even more shocking turn in June 2024, when Rex Heuermann was charged with 2 additional murders that expanded the timeline of his alleged crimes by decades. Jessica Taylor, whose partial remains were found at Gilgo Beach in 2011, had actually been murdered in 2003, 7 years before the discovery of the original 4 victims. Her case had initially been treated as unrelated to the Gilgo Beach murders, but DNA evidence now linked her death to Rex Heuermann. Even more disturbing was the charge related to Sandra Costilla, whose murder dated back to 1993, nearly 30 years before Rex's arrest. Sandra's remains had been discovered in Southampton, about an hour east of Gilgo Beach, but genetic evidence now suggested that she too had been killed by the same person responsible for the more recent murders. The expanded timeline revealed that Rex Heuermann had potentially been killing for 3 decades, far longer than investigators had originally suspected. He hadn't just been an active serial killer from 2007 to 2010, he had been hunting victims since at least 1993, possibly longer. In December 2024, prosecutors added yet another victim to Rex's alleged crimes. Valerie Mack, whose dismembered remains were found in 2000 and 2011, became the 7th woman that Rex was charged with murdering. Like the other victims, Valerie was a sex worker whose death had initially been treated as an isolated incident rather than part of a larger pattern. The expanding list of victims painted a picture of a methodical predator who had operated with impunity for decades, carefully selecting vulnerable targets and disposing of their bodies across multiple locations and time periods. Each new charge was supported by the same type of DNA evidence that had originally linked Rex to the Gilgo Beach victims. Hair samples from each victim had yielded genetic profiles that matched Rex or his family members through whole genome sequencing. The family contamination evidence was particularly chilling because it suggested that Rex had been bringing trace evidence from his crimes into his home, unknowingly contaminating his wife and children with genetic material from his victims. His double life hadn't just deceived his family, it had made them unwitting participants in the forensic evidence that would eventually convict him. Investigators also discovered that Rex had kept detailed records and evidence from his crimes, including searches for information about the investigations, victim identification, and police procedures. His online activity revealed someone who was closely following news coverage of his own crimes while maintaining the facade of a concerned citizen interested in the case. The searches found in Rex's home computers included queries about victim decomposition, police investigation techniques, and specific details about the Gilgo Beach discoveries. He had been monitoring his own manhunt for years, possibly taking satisfaction in the failure of investigators to identify him. Most disturbing were discoveries suggesting that Rex had been planning additional murders at the time of his arrest. Investigators found evidence that he had been actively seeking new victims through online advertisements and communications platforms. The investigation also revealed that Rex's crimes might have been even more extensive than the charges suggested. Investigators were exploring potential connections to other unsolved murders and disappearances throughout the region, looking for additional victims who might have been killed by the same predator. The expanding case against Rex Heuermann demonstrated that serial killers often operate for much longer periods than initially suspected, and that advancing forensic technology could reveal patterns and connections that had been missed in earlier investigations. But even as the evidence against Rex continued to mount, his defense team was preparing for what promised to be one of the most complex and scientifically sophisticated criminal trials in New York history.